The Cornwall Alliance is an evangelical Christian network of academics, theologians, and faith leaders. Their focus is environmental stewardship, but they doubt the mainstream science of man-made climate change. And through newsletters, articles, and films, they spread that doubt to other Christians around the world. The group's leader is E. Calvin Beisner. I spoke with him at his home in Florida to understand why his group pushes back against curbing man-made climate change.
A lot of environmental policy tends to slow or stop economic development, and poverty, we think, is a much greater risk than matters related to the environment. And so we want to make sure that what we do to be good stewards of the environment is also good stewardship for human flourishing.
So the Cornwall Alliance supports the idea that the planet is warming, and supports the idea that humans contribute to that warming, but you believe that that contribution might be overstated.
Yeah, I think so. And I appreciate your asking the question that way, because all too often the public just hears a polarized thing. You believe in global warming or you don't, and that's not the case at all. Human addition of carbon dioxide and other what are called greenhouse gases to the atmosphere surely must have made the atmosphere somewhat warmer than it otherwise would have been. That's basic physics. But basic physics also says that if you drop a rock and a feather at the same moment from the same altitude, they're going to hit the ground at the same moment, unless they're in air, in which case the feather wafts around like this and the rock goes straight down. And if it's windy, the feather might blow up into a tree and never come down, right? So the world is a far more complicated place than basic physics tells us.
Although the Cornwall Alliance counts several scientists in its ranks, the vast majority of scientists in the U.S. and worldwide don't agree with the group's views on climate change. Most scientists say humans do have a significant impact on the changing climate through carbon emissions and other greenhouse gases that create a heat-trapping layer around the Earth. In November 2017, even a government study from the Trump administration issued a dire warning about climate change and called human activity the dominant driver. Still, the White House has pulled out of the Paris Climate Accords, leaving the U.S. as the only nation in the world to oppose the pact to curb carbon emissions. Every other nation on Earth, from major allies in Europe to regimes in North Korea, and after this interview, even Syria, have signed or ratified the agreement. Does it worry you to compare the nations that have signed on to the accord and those that have not? I mean, we don't have a lot of company.
Not much. The vast majority of the nations that have signed on are developing nations. Their individual contributions, their intended contributions, are for the most part insignificant as far as global CO2 emissions are concerned. They are entirely voluntary, and I think that most of them signed on because there is a major aspect of the Paris Treaty that involves a payment of money from the developed countries to the developing countries. And so that's what they get out of it. But they're also totally voluntary. There's no enforcement mechanism. And so I expect that the Paris Treaty will do no better than did the Kyoto Protocol. And frankly, the United States was one of only a handful of nations that achieved the emission reductions intended under the Kyoto Protocol, and it wasn't even a party to the protocol. But it did it because its economy managed to find more efficient ways of providing energy, especially switching from coal to natural gas.
One thing I've heard talking to Christians, even in my own family, about this issue is when you bring up climate change, often the response is, well, it's in God's hands, which everything is. But I think that, in a way, can promote inaction. What is your response to that sentiment? I mean, what do you say to that?
When I pray, give us this day our daily bread, I don't sit on my hands and wait for it to fall out of the sky. And I don't know any Christians who do. And unfortunately, I think there has been this caricature of Christians that their belief in the providence of God or in God's control over all things results in a do-nothing attitude. That neglects the fact that the Bible teaches that the God who controls all things uses means. And among those means are hard work for our daily bread and carefully studying the climate system so that we can understand the consequences of choices that we make. But basically, that whole thing, I think, is a caricature. Now, I can say this, that I think the larger the scale of things, the more difficult it is for us to know enough facts relevant to how an entire system works, for us to have great confidence in any process that we might devise to try to control things at that scale, all right? For instance, the climate system is probably the most complicated physical system we've ever studied, with the exception of the human brain or DNA. There are thousands of feedback mechanisms in the climate system. The vast majority of them, we don't know their magnitude. And for many of them, we don't know whether they're negative or positive. And so the notion that we know well enough how this chaotic, fluid, dynamic system is going to respond to adding a certain amount of CO2 to the atmosphere, I think it just goes beyond what our physical knowledge is capable of giving us.
And that's what I
point.
am getting at, I guess, in bringing this up.
And so to that, it's a rational response to say, you know, I think it's a really interesting thing to study, and the more we learn about it, the more willing we might be to try to do something about it. But at this stage, our knowledge of it is so small that we have to say, all right, so far as the physics is concerned, we know it's a chaotic system. So far as theology is concerned, we know that God is in control of chaos.
Almost half of U.S. adults agree with the scientific consensus on climate change, that human activity is the main factor. But only about a quarter of evangelical Christians agree. And because evangelicals make up a huge swath of the voting population, their opinion really matters when U.S. lawmakers consider legislation to curb man-made climate change.